Good evening, everyone. We have a sociable group tonight, but I will ask us all to find a seat if that's okay. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Megan Radecki. It's my pleasure to serve as your director here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. And on behalf of the center, we want to welcome you all to our final public program of the semester. Do not fear, it's not our final public program ever, just of the semester. So thank you all for coming out. If any of you missed our Veterans Day program on Tuesday, I want to give a belated happy Veterans Day to any veterans in the audience. We had a great celebration honoring and remembering those who sacrificed and fought on our behalf for our freedoms, which we will talk about tonight. So thank you to any of you who may have served who are with us this evening. I'm thrilled to see students, Cook Leadership Academy fellows here in the crowd, of course, some of our colleagues and our faculty, Hauenstein Center members, and the community. You all are the reason why we do this programming, and you all are the reason why we've had such a successful fall. We have had excellent attendance over the past few programs. I think we're averaging somewhere around 130 per evening, which is marked growth over the last couple of years. So we're glad you're all getting out of your homes and making time for us. Thank you. Makes us feel great. For those of you who might be watching at home, we appreciate that as well. So please keep tuning in. If we think about the programs that we've had this fall, it's been a variety, but also there are some things that we find in common. We start our season with Garrett Graff talking about the greatest generation. Alon Werman gave us some insight into the Constitution and some of the administrative rights and responsibilities that come with the presidency. James Ramoser and Elizabeth Foley gave us some very spirited discussion about the Supreme Court and the cases that they are deciding right this very minute. Ambassador Julie Smith and Kay Bailey Hutchison spoke of their very recent days representing the U.S. to NATO and what it looks like for us and our allies abroad. Veterans Day, of course, we just celebrated with the help of some GV vets, and a woman named Ingrid Tai, who runs the Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center, is a veteran herself. And tonight we sort of land back in the same place where we start, and that is on the theme of freedom and the idea of freedom. It's an ideal, it's a value that Americans hold quite dear, and tonight we're going to hear some very interesting commentary and research and study about Barry Goldwater and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and about the differing ideas they held about it and the differing ideas that still persist in our world today. So enough about me and my thoughts about the season, which I thought was terrific. Thank you. Let's get started. To help me introduce our speaker and also share some of his own reflections on freedom and leadership is Evan Jackson, one of our Cook Leadership Academy fellows. Let me share just a few words about Evan. Evan hails from Brighton, Michigan, and he's a senior at Grand Valley State, pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Economics, a Bachelor of Business Administration and Finance, and a minor in English. As Student Senate President, he works to amplify student voices and lead initiatives that foster meaningful collaboration across campus. He takes a steady, collaborative approach to leadership, turning ideas into tangible results. Outside of his academic and leadership roles, Evan enjoys staying active at the gym, reading, and spending time with his dogs. Friends, help me welcome Evan Jackson.
Freedom sounds so liberating and straightforward until you have it. When I was elected Student Senate President, I imagined freedom as possibility, open doors, fresh ideas, and a chance to leave my mark. What I found instead was weight. The weight of expectation, the weight of representing thousands of students, the weight of knowing that I could either build something lasting or waste my chance entirely. It felt like Atlas in Greek mythology, holding the sky, heavy but powerful. I began to understand freedom isn't a gift you receive without responsibility. Freedom, I've learned, isn't permission, it's accountability. It's the understanding that every choice we make impacts someone else's experience. It asks for action, not alone, but for intention, for the courage to do what's right, not just what's possible. That realization reshaped how I think about leadership. Leadership isn't a position or a title, it's responsibility. It's not about being in charge, It's about being accountable for the people who trust you to lead. And it's not about what you accomplish for yourself. It's about what you help others see in themselves. Because leadership that ends with you is not leadership. I saw that truth come to life earlier this year during a General Assembly meeting with 50 of our student senators. I divided Senate into small groups for what seemed like a simple exercise. I asked each group one question. If you had a magic wand and could do anything for students, what would you do? At first, it was all imagination, big, ambitious ideas. But then, as the room filled with energy, something clicked. People realized what we had most dreamed about did not need a magic wand. It was attainable. It just required ownership. That is leadership. Watching people realize they do not need permission to create change. Seeing others step into their own agency. Watching confidence replace hesitation. Realizing that collective progress begins with individual belief. That's where freedom and leadership intersect. Freedom gives us the ability to move forward, and leadership makes us responsible for those who we bring with us. Every time a student senator takes an initiative, every time someone chooses to act rather than wait, that is freedom in motion and leadership in action. And when we multiply that across a community, we build something larger than any of us could carry ourselves. If freedom is the American dream, then leadership is how we keep it alive, by using our influence to empower others to do the same. My name is Evan Jackson, and I am a leader. It is now my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Nicholas Buccola. Dr. Nicholas Buccola is the Dr. Jules K. Whitehill Professor of Humanism and Ethics in the Department of Government at Claremont McKenna College. A specialist in American political thought, he is the author of One Man's Freedom, Goldwater, King, and the Struggle Over an American Ideal, just published in October. The Fire is Upon Us, and the Political Thought of Frederick Douglass. He has edited volumes including The Essential Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and Liberal Democracy. His essays appear in scholarly journals and outlets such as the New York Times, Salon, and Dissent. And a quick fun fact about Dr. Buccola, his favorite president is Abraham Lincoln, due to Lincoln's role in the liberation of millions of people, including some of Dr. Buccola's Louisiana ancestors, with an honorable mention of James Garfield, inspired by the recent Netflix series, Death by Lightning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Buccola.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's hard to follow Evan, geez, and Megan. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Karen, Darren, Kaylor, who's not here, but helped set this up. I'm so grateful for the opportunity. It's such an impressive list of folks who've spoken at the center, and so I'm really, really honored and humbled. Elon Werman, by the way, is a Claremont McKenna alum, and it was before I got there, so I take no responsibility for what he said. But Elon's quite a guy. I've met him before. So I'm really, really excited to be here, and I'm going to just give you a sense of this story that I tell in this book. And I want to start us out with a couple of clips of my principal subjects in the book, Barry Goldwater and Martin Luther King. Here's Barry Goldwater.
And let our republicanism, so focused and so dedicated, not be made fuzzy and futile by unthinking and stupid labels. I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
So that was Goldwater in July 1964 at the Republican National Convention accepting his party's nomination for president. And here is Martin Luther King just about 3 months later, a week before the election, speaking in Los Angeles.
I come here to urge every person under the sound of my voice to go to the polls on the 3rd of November and vote your convictions. Now, I know you're intelligent people, and I don't need to tell you who you should vote for. I don't have any fear about that. You know who to vote for. I'm just asking you to vote. Now, just if you need... Now, if you need a little information on my convictions at this point, I must honestly admit to you that I am not going to vote for Mr. Goldwater.
All right. So with King and Goldwater now in the room with us, let's talk about the premise for this story. So I have up here this title, The Most Dangerous Men in America. And that is the name of, that's what I called the epilogue in the book. And this is something that comes from something King said about Goldwater and something that was said about King by J. Edgar Hoover. So let me tell you a little bit about the King line. So King is interviewed just after the election. So spoiler alert, although this is the Center for Presidential Studies, Goldwater loses. And as you can see at the bottom there on C-SPAN, he lost quite dramatically. So just after the election, King is being interviewed by the writer Alex Haley. And he is asked by Haley, if you were sent to the proverbial desert island, what book, you could have one book, what book would you bring with you? It's a good icebreaker if you ever have the need for one. King says, well, I'm a minister, so I guess I'd have to choose the Bible. But if I couldn't choose the Bible, I would choose Plato's Republic. I know there's some political theory students in the house, and so King says I would choose Plato's Republic. And then Haley had an interesting follow-up, which is that he said, if you had to send somebody to the desert island, who would you send? Could also be a slightly awkward icebreaker if you want to use that one. And here's what King said. I'll quote him. He said, I guess I wouldn't mind seeing Mr. Goldwater dispatched to a desert island. If they'd feed him and everything, of course. I am nonviolent, you know. Certainly he should be on a desert island politically. Until that defeat, Goldwater was the most dangerous man in America. He talked soft and nice, but he gave aid and comfort to the most vicious racists and the most extreme rightists in America. Now, Goldwater never said anything quite like that about King. Goldwater actually didn't say much about King, which is part of the story I'm going to tell tonight. But J. Edgar Hoover, early in 1964, called King the most dangerous man in America. And I'll say a little bit later about the war that Hoover declared on King over the course of that year. But it's important to know that King was not especially popular among white folks. So this is something we've sort of forgotten. I think a lot of Americans have forgotten. To give you a sense of this, I mean, we often think of King as this sort of universally revered figure. But Pew, the great polling agency, did a poll in May 1963. And among white people, King was held unfavorably by 65% of those polled. Now, I know what you're thinking. You think, well, that was May 1963. In August 1963, King delivered the I Have a Dream speech, and everyone loves the I Have a Dream speech, so that things must have changed. Sorry, they didn't change much. By August 1964, when Pew asked the same question, white respondents, it increased by 3%. So there was a 62% disapproval rating for Martin Luther King. And Goldwater, I'll argue, was among those who disapproved of Martin Luther King. And certainly the American right, and Goldwater was the leader of the American right at the time, they were very hostile toward King's message. So the question at the heart of this book is why we have these two movements, this really crucial moment in American political history, and they're both marching under a banner of freedom. You heard in the clip from Goldwater, he's pledging his commitment to extremism in defense of liberty. And just outside the Cow Palace in San Francisco that night is the largest civil rights demonstration since the March on Washington. People marching under the banner of freedom opposing Goldwater. So one of the questions that I started with in this book is you have these two freedom movements. You have these two people who think of themselves as freedom leaders, and they view each other with a great deal of suspicion and even hostility. So my question is why? And that's one of the things we'll try to get at tonight. And not only is this a historical question, but I'm hoping that this is a question that can be held up to all of us as a mirror as we sort of think about our own political lives and think about freedom and leadership, as Evan was describing. How can this story help us make sense of our responsibility in the present? The plan, I will proceed by way of mostly photographs. There's very little text after. There's one more slide with text, but I really am into photographs. I have a lot of photographs in the book. All my syllabi for my classes have a lot of photographs. I always tell students that you can learn a lot about a thinker that we're studying by just staring at their face for a little while. And so we're going to look at some photographs together. And I wanted to pick out a few episodes in this story that I tell in the book that will help capture the essence of what I'm up to here. I should say, by way of background, this book is the second in a projected trilogy where I'm thinking about the civil rights and conservative movements together. So my last book was called The Fire Is Upon Us. As Evan mentioned, that was the subtitles James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and the debate over race in America. And as many of you know, Baldwin, the sort of leading writer associated with the civil rights, that phase of the civil rights revolution, had this debate with William F. Buckley, the leading writer of the conservative movement, February 18th, 1965 in Cambridge, England, and they were asked to debate race and the American dream. And so I wrote a book about that debate and the story of Baldwin and Buckley, the lives they led leading up to that night in Cambridge. And so that was kind of a dual biography sort of thing. But as I worked on that book, I sort of, the political theorist in me, as a political theorist who teaches a class called What is Freedom, I was interested in writing a book about the uses of freedom in this era in these two movements. And so I came up with a proposal to write about Goldwater and King and various activists and intellectuals. And my editor looked at my proposal and said, this is a good idea, but there are limits to book bindery technology. You have way too much going on here. So maybe this will be volume 2 in a trilogy where you're thinking about these movements together. So this story is a little bit different. Goldwater is about 20 years older. With Buckley and Baldwin, they're born about 15 months apart from each other. So I kind of used a parallel lives approach. This story is a little different. Goldwater, the sort of ebbs and flows of their careers are a little bit different. Goldwater is about 20 years older than King. But you'll see, I sort of pick up the story in 1955 when both of them are rising on the national scene. And that's where we're going to begin tonight. All right, so Barry Goldwater has a message. So this is a picture of Goldwater soon after he's elected to the Senate in the early 1950s. And Goldwater is somebody who sort of stumbles into politics, isn't really seeking out a political career. He's a businessman. His family ran Goldwater department stores in Arizona. Goldwater dropped out of college so that he could help run the family business after his father passed away when he was, I think, only just about a sophomore at the University of Arizona. And so he's not somebody who's especially interested in politics. He dabbles here and there, writes letters to the editor about various political issues over the years. Eventually, he is elected to the Phoenix City Council as a kind of reform candidate. And so he's kind of talked into doing that. And then he runs this dark horse bid for the U.S. Senate in 1952, running against the then Senate Majority Leader, Ernest McFarland. And so Goldwater, nobody thinks Goldwater is going to win. In Arizona at the time, the Democratic Party dominates. The registration rates for the Democrats are about twice what they are for the Republicans. So Goldwater runs and he actually wins. He surprises everybody, including himself. So all of a sudden, he's in the United States Senate. And he gets to the Senate and he's not quite sure. He writes that, you know how maybe some of you can share this experience with Goldwater. Have you ever started keeping a diary and those first few weeks, you're writing all the time and it's really you look back at it and wow, I was really cooking. And then after 3 or 4 weeks, you just stop altogether. Goldwater was kind of like that in the Senate. So we have this really interesting snapshot of what it was like for him when he got to the U.S. Senate. And one of the things that is revealed there is really a sense of vulnerability and that he was sort of out ahead of his skis. He didn't quite know what he was doing. And he confesses that in his diary. But he realizes pretty quickly that he's not really going to have the right personality to be a great legislator, to build coalitions, to do sort of horse trading to get things done. What he really is a salesman. His most sort of claim to fame as a salesman was he created something called antsy pants. These are boxer shorts that looked like they were covered in ants. And so that was his kind of major claim to fame as a salesman at Goldwater department store. But his colleagues recognize in him the ability to sell ideas. And so they make him, during his first term, when he's a freshman U.S. Senator, the Senate campaign chair. They send him out on the road. And he is speaking, pretty much all the time. He's out on the road speaking to civic groups. Eventually he'll become a very popular campus speaker. I'll talk a little bit about that later. He'll speak to, any sort of Republican group, religious groups, civic groups. And he's out there with a message about freedom. So my first chapter in the book is called Prophets with the PH Rising. So King is going to be rising at this time as well. He's going to be preaching his gospel of freedom. And Goldwater is going to be on the road preaching another gospel of freedom. And there's a couple things I want to highlight about what Goldwater is doing in these early days. The first thing, before any audience in the early to mid 1950s, Goldwater would begin any speech that he was giving with emphasis on the idea that freedom is in peril. Now, it's really interesting to think about, this in historical context. This is the mid 1950s, a time where we tend to think about American politics as being governed by a sort of widespread consensus. Not so for Goldwater. Goldwater told one audience of young Republicans in 1955, this kind of time we think of as consensus. He says that to these young Republicans, the challenge to freedom in our own time is more severe than Lincoln and the Republicans had to shoulder during the Civil War. That's an interesting, one of the things we want to think about is why would Goldwater say this sort of a thing? Well, he thought the two biggest threats to freedom at the time were quote unquote big government and big labor. So Goldwater is asked to serve on the Labor Committee by the Senate Majority Leader when he enters the Senate, Robert Taft. Goldwater did not think this was the right role for him. He had other ideas. He thought he should be on a committee that was more relevant to particular Arizona issues, like the sort of Interior Committee, something like that. But Taft tells him, I want you to be on this committee because you're a businessman, and I want a businessman on this committee. And so Goldwater goes into this role, and he really rises to power throughout the 1950s as a major critic of big labor, of what he took to be the excesses of big labor. And so that ends up being a really crucial part of his rise in Republican Party politics. And he also is a critic, he had been before he entered the Senate, a critic of quote unquote big government, a critic of the welfare state, a critic of the New Deal. This is the first letters to the editor that he's writing as just an ordinary citizen are criticisms of Franklin Roosevelt. He's a critic of the Fair Deal, of Harry Truman. And Goldwater is defining freedom in these early days as a kind of rugged individualism. He is not somebody who's particularly bookish by his own admission. His politics really come less out of books than they do his sense of his pioneer forebears who helped settle Arizona. And the sort of like he really governed, his politics were governed by instinct more than anything else. But I want to give you a couple phrases that Goldwater used in this early period to give you a sense of the sorts of things that he was saying to audiences. He said to one audience in the mid-50s, the motto of the left-wing pack. He didn't call them liberals because he thought that was an insult to liberalism. So he says, and I'll tell you more about that later, but the left-wing pack is to emasculate the citizen and then give him a $10 bill so that he will be helpless and we can do with him as we will. The left-wing pack had given out a dole of inflated greenbacks as a pacifier for lost manhood. So there's this kind of gendered thing going on here as well. And so Goldwater would talk about that, these major threats to freedom, and then he would always end his speeches, as one should, with a call to action. And he would say to his audiences, I want you to proceed from this hall with, and this is again a quote, an evangelistic fervor and preach the gospel of the free competitive way of life. So Goldwater is really emphasizing free enterprise, limited government, and these sorts of things in these early years. Okay, meanwhile, December 1955, so right around the same time of the speeches I just quoted, this is the scene. In December 1955, up here at the front in this grainy photograph, you have a 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. 26 years old, just think about that. And here he is in Holt Street Baptist Church. This was not his congregation. King is there because he has just been named the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. which is the organizing group that will become the organizing group for the Montgomery bus boycott. So we all know the story of Rosa Parks sitting down on that bus where she wasn't supposed to sit, being told to get up and leave, and she refused and got arrested, and the Montgomery bus boycott begins. King was the bookish type. He had spent most of the last 10 years, he goes off to college when he's like 16 years old, he goes to Morehouse, and he's been studying theology and philosophy for the last 10 years, and he gets his first pastor, his first pastorate is in Montgomery, not at this church. His church was a more middle class, church. This was a working class church, Holt Street Baptist Church. And King shows up, and they make him the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, mostly because he hadn't been in town long enough to make that many enemies. So there's other possibilities that seem like a more natural fit for this leadership role. This is an important thing for us, for the leaders to think about, the future leaders and the present leaders to think about, right? Is that he's not seeking out this opportunity. He wants to have his congregation, but he basically hasn't been there long enough to make that many enemies. And so they appoint him, they make him the head of this Montgomery Improvement Association. So he's at Holt Street Baptist Church. You have all these African-American working class folks who have no choice but to ride those buses that are governed by a really degrading system of segregation. King will write a letter, an open letter to the Montgomery City public just after this meeting. And I want to give you a scene from that letter because I think it really captures the sort of degradation of the Montgomery bus system just in one story. In that letter to the Montgomery public, King tells the story of a young mother who's attempting to get on the bus while holding two of her children. And she gets onto the bus and she's trying to figure out how to get the fare out of her purse while she's holding her kids and give it to the driver. And she can't quite pull it off. So she puts her kids on the front seat of the bus, much to the alarm of the driver. And so the driver then causes the bus to lunge forward and slams on the brakes to make the children fall out of the seat onto the floor. And so King tells that story just to capture in one horrifying vignette the sort of terror that was the Montgomery bus system for a lot of these folks. And so King's up there. He has not prepared a speech. He's in front of all these people. There's actually 4,000 people gathered. So between the number of people in the church and various other rooms in the church, and then outside the church, they're projecting speakers outside. There's all these people gathered there who are wondering, what they're going to do, how they're going to organize this bus boycott. King gets up there, and I always recommend to people to listen to this speech, because I think, and this is true with a lot of King's oratory and other oratory, I think reading it is one thing, but hearing it is something entirely different. The writer James Baldwin said of King that the magic, when he saw King preach for the first time in 1957, he said the magic of King as an orator is his ability to sort of feel and capture the energy of his audience and accept that energy as a gift and then give it back to them. And you hear that when you listen to what he did at Holt Street Baptist Church that night. He starts out rather slowly, and he speaks to them about the bus boycott a little bit. And then you hear, you sort of like the experience in a black church, there's audience participation. People are saying there's an amen here and a that's right there, but they really come alive. The room really comes alive. The space comes alive when King says this. He says, "And my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression." The two words that you can really hear the audience come alive are time and tired. You can just hear the congregation come alive. And then he says, so then he picks up on that, and he realizes that this is the message. He says, "There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November." So what I argue in the book is that, so if we're thinking about Goldwater over here, espousing this kind of rugged individualism, King is going to espouse a philosophy of freedom that's much less individualist, much more communitarian, much more democratic. It's about freedom as conscientious collaboration. The Montgomery bus boycott is a remarkable feat. This is organized mostly by the women of Montgomery, who figure out a system of carpooling and a system of getting people where they need to go. These folks participate in the boycott. They had to rely on those buses where they needed to go to live. And so they have to figure out a way by collaborating with each other as a community to get people where they need to go without using this bus system. And so King really emphasizes the radically democratic, collaborative nature of freedom. One of my favorite moments when I was doing the research for the book, where I thought King captured this really well, is that he's on trial as a conspirator in the Montgomery bus boycott. And so he's sitting there being questioned by this white lawyer, and the lawyer asks him, he says, who formulated the demands of the Montgomery Improvement Association? And King says, the 4,000 people who gathered at Holt Street Baptist Church formulated the demands of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And the lawyer looks at him like, what do you mean? 4,000 people can't formulate anything. And King says, it depends on what you mean by formulate. So for King, he said again and again, he ends up on the cover of Time magazine soon, the photo I showed a minute ago, but he emphasizes that had I never come along, this movement would have happened. And the movement really is about this radically democratic energy of the people themselves. And so what he was trying to do is capture that energy as he did in this magic way that night, and try to express what was happening and bear witness to what was happening. So I want to proceed with, I'm going to sort of jump through history a little bit here and bring us to the sort of climactic moment in the book is 1964, when Goldwater is running for president. This is the sort of when Goldwater and King will really clash. But you can probably sense already, based on what I've told you, that even though they don't know much about each other yet, that they are kind of on this collision course, or we'll see how they're on this collision course. I wanted to just start, this is the last bit of text, is A Tale of Two Goldwaters. I want to give you a sense of, like, when we're thinking about Goldwater and questions of race and civil rights, he proves to be a rather complicated case. And I have pictured over here a woman by the name of Catherine Maxwell Dixon later in life. I don't have a photograph of her earlier in life, in 1952, Goldwater hires Catherine as a legislative aide to him in the Senate. When he's elected to the Senate, she's an Arizonan. Her husband is going to go to dental school at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She applies for a job in Goldwater's Senate office, and he hires her. And this is a remarkable thing. And this is captures something that's really important to know about Goldwater, is that he was, on a personal level, on an instinctual level, quite racially progressive. So he hires Dixon as a legislative aide. She's only the second African-American legislative aide in the Senate at that time. And one story that's told about her service in that office early on is that she goes to eat in the Senate cafeteria with her colleagues, other Senate aides, and she's told she can't sit with them. And the story, as it's told by one of Goldwater's biographers, is that he picks up the phone and has an angry phone call and puts an end to that. That was consistent with his character, and so he doesn't have a press conference about it. He doesn't, issue a press release. But apparently, if this, biographer is I couldn't find much verification of that story, but I think, I don't have reason to doubt it, because it was the sort of thing he did in Arizona. On a lot of these questions in Arizona, he had a relatively progressive point of view. He supported the desegregation of the Phoenix airport, the Arizona National Guard. He gave some moderate support to the NAACP early on in his time in Arizona. So there's some reasons to believe that this is like a sort of something that captures the truth about Goldwater. So there's that Goldwater. But then the second Goldwater, it's the same Goldwater, but doing something slightly different, is cozying up with people like Strom Thurmond, who's pictured on the right here. Senator from South Carolina. Thurmond, of course, had run for president in 1948 as a segregationist candidate, sort of broke off from the Democratic Party and ran on the states' rights Dixiecrat ticket. And Thurmond was, one of the Senate's leading segregationists. And there's no sort of question about Thurmond's commitment to white supremacy, to racism, in any way you define it. In terms of his politics, it was clear as day. And Goldwater is cozying up to Thurmond in all sorts of different ways, and actually identifies Thurmond as a potential ally. So Goldwater really predicts the future. Just to give you a sense of the future and come back to this moment, Thurmond in 1964, September 1964, will leave the Democratic Party to join the Republican Party to support Goldwater for president. So way back in 1953, Barry Goldwater writes in his diary, "I sense here a realignment of Southern conservative Democrats with Democrats and Republicans of the West and Middle West." On one side, Goldwater wrote, are the New Deal and Fair Deal folks, who are controlled, this is the quote, controlled by the labor unions and the stronger minority groups. On the other side would be the Western senator and the Southern senator who believe in the freedom of the individual and the freedom of the states. And so Goldwater, in 1956, he speaks at the Citadel in South Carolina. This is we're now months into the Montgomery bus boycott. So civil rights is in the news in all sorts of ways. The Brown v. Board school desegregation decision happened in 1954. And there is this massive backlash against that decision. The very time Goldwater is speaking at the Citadel, Thurman is working on what's known as the Southern Manifesto. He's writing the Southern Manifesto, which will be this declaration of resistance to any attempt to implement the Brown v. Board decision short of violence. Thurman is writing that, and Goldwater is in South Carolina to speak at the Citadel, and he talks about Thurmond, who's on the on the opposite side of the aisle. But Goldwater says at the Citadel that Thurmond is one of the great men of the U.S. Senate. And while these things are happening, while the Montgomery bus boycott is happening just a few hundred miles away, just 400 miles west of where Goldwater is standing at the Citadel, Goldwater only makes one mention of race in the entire speech that he gives in South Carolina. And this is indicative of what he was doing throughout the 1950s. He criticizes the left-wing pack for magnifying differences among men in order to promote a politics that is fundamentally negative and divisive, Goldwater said. When he speaks, I'm quoting Goldwater, he speaks not to all Americans as Americans, but rather he pits labor against management, farmer against worker, black against white, Jew against Gentile, Catholic against Protestant, and rich against poor. And so Goldwater gives that speech, which is a speech that's about freedom. That's his theme that day. And he says that what we need to commit ourselves to is two things: free enterprise and states' rights. This is not a message that King is ready to accept. King, right around the same time, this is a picture of the 1957 March on Washington that King participates in, known as the Prayer Pilgrimage. And at that event, it's a much smaller gathering than the one that will happen in 1963, but a really important one. And one of the things that happens at that event is King is now, now he's at the forefront. By this time, the Montgomery bus boycott is over, and he is figuring out how to position himself as a civil rights leader. And he's heading this thing called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he's collaborating with these other civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, who's sort of central in the organized labor, and Bayard Rustin and others. So at this prayer pilgrimage, King they sort of divide the labor in terms of their speeches they're going to give. There's A. Philip Randolph, who was so crucial in the labor movement, is going to talk about the importance of economic empowerment in terms of what matters and how do we make people free. Roy Wilkins from the NAACP is going to talk about the importance of school desegregation and actually getting the country to follow through on what the Supreme Court said they had to do over 3 years earlier. And King is given the challenge of talking about voting rights. And one of the things that comes through in all of these speeches, and certainly in King's, is that it's something that casts some doubt on this formulation that Goldwater had of committing ourselves to the freedom of the individual and what he called the freedom of the states, or states' rights. King wants to ask, what do we do when those two things are not consistent with each other? And King says that it's necessary in all these different areas that are being emphasized at the prayer pilgrimage for the federal government to act boldly to vindicate the freedom of African Americans through laws that protect voting rights, combat economic discrimination, and promote desegregation. King says in that speech, the line that I thought I would use to emphasize is, he says, there is a dire need in this country for a liberalism that is truly liberal. And if you think about liberalism, and as King's using it here as a philosophy that's fundamentally about securing the conditions necessary for people to be free, right? That idea of liberalism in the broadest sense, liberty being at the same root as liberal. King says that that sort of liberalism could defeat what he called the unholy alliance of Southern Dixiecrats, doesn't name names, but we think Southern Dixiecrats like Thurmond, and, quote, right-wing reactionary Republicans. Doesn't name names, but I think he has people like Goldwater in mind. Okay, so now to sort of fast forward through history a bit more, I want to highlight just sort of three key moments in civil rights activism to sort of set up the ultimate clash between Goldwater and King in 1964. This is a picture of the sit-in protests. These are students who are inspired by King and by the Montgomery Improvement Association in some ways, but they're also doing their own thing. This starts with a group of 4 students in North Carolina who decide to sit down where they weren't supposed to sit down. And of course, they are attacked in all sorts of different ways as a result of doing so. And as one of their mentors, the great Ella Baker, the civil rights activist Ella Baker, says this movement, this sit-in movement is much bigger than a hamburger. Right? It's not about getting a mediocre hamburger at these counters. It's about human dignity. And so these students begin to sit down, and then that spreads like wildfire, and more students begin to sit down where they're not supposed to sit. And it's one of the things I emphasize in the book is, King is sort of playing this interesting role now where he's kind of an inspiration to some of these students, but also they want to push him on certain things. He's trying to figure out what he's supposed to do in relation to what they're doing. Should he go sit with them, for example, when they go to sit in Atlanta, where he's from? Should he give them sort of guidance in what they're doing, or should just let them do their own thing? Goldwater is mostly staying silent. I'm going to emphasize Goldwater's silence in a minute, and I'll just say something about it right now. At this time, Goldwater is, he's got the floor of the Senate at his disposal. He's got eventually he's going to have a syndicated newspaper column. He's on the road speaking, 40 weeks out of the year. He's in the spring of 1960 when these students are doing this thing that's capturing, international headlines. Goldwater is on the road giving all sorts of commencement speeches to college students, right? These are college students. And Goldwater does not mention a word about what they're doing. And he's giving speeches about freedom. So I think that is a theme that you'll see running through Goldwater. In 1961, you have the Freedom Rides. This is, I emphasize, to students and to audiences that it's important to know what the Freedom Rides, although the sort of sit-in protest can be seen as an act of civil disobedience. The Freedom Rides, James Farmer, who was one of the key organizers, would always emphasize this is not an act of civil disobedience. We were trying to see if they would actually uphold the law as it was stated, saying that in interstate bus travel, they could not segregate the buses or segregate the bus terminals. And so, as many of you know, from what happened on the Freedom Rides is they set out from Washington, D.C., heading south, and eventually they're attacked through coordinated efforts of the Ku Klux Klan and law enforcement in places like Anniston, Alabama. And again, this is something that's happening, and mostly Goldwater is staying silent. And of course, King is being drawn further and further into the center, into the eye of the storm. By this time, he's not only trying to figure out how to deal with these different student activist groups and how to coordinate with them, but also he's being invited into the realm of power a little bit more, beginning to engage the Kennedy administration in a serious way. And then finally, the Birmingham campaign, which is really I think the civil rights campaign that we probably associate most closely with King. He plays a role in planning this campaign in one of the most segregated places in the country. As many of you will know, King and the other organizers of the Birmingham campaign decide to go into Birmingham in particular because they know that the Commissioner of Public Safety there, this guy named Bull Connor, who had devoted every ounce of his energy for decades to white supremacy, they knew that Bull Connor would react harshly to anything that they did. And King thought that was important because they wanted to dramatize the injustice. They wanted to draw attention to just how horrific this system was, and they knew that Connor would help them do that. And King says before they leave, he said, "I don't think all of us will make it back." He knows how dangerous this is, and he goes into this campaign knowing that some of the activists could be killed, but he thinks it's very important to do that. And of course, King himself gets arrested There's this dramatic, moment when he's in the Gaston Motel in Birmingham, and the campaign has begun, and he's there discussing with his advisors whether or not he should put himself in the position of getting arrested. And King listens to them argue about it for a while, the sort of strategic value or potential problems with him getting arrested. And then he asks them for some time, and he goes into his room, and he thinks and he prays, and he comes out and he says, I think it's important that I put myself on the line and that I get arrested along with these other protesters. And it's when he's in jail that he writes the famous letter from Birmingham jail. And the letter from Birmingham jail is an amazing document. Everyone should read it and reread it. And I just want to emphasize 2 points that King makes in this piece. One is that he comes back to that theme that he talked about way back at Holt Street Baptist Church, time. Time is at the heart of the letter from Birmingham jail, because King's writing the letter. Really, his audience are the moderates, are the apathetic people, or the people who are maybe with him in spirit but think he's acting too fast. He writes that letter in response to those who thought that the Birmingham campaign was maybe justified but ill-timed. And King says, you're always telling us to wait. We've been waiting for 340 years. When is it going to be time? And so King says that I think one sense of time, one sense of urgency, has a lot to do with where one sits, or with the space one occupies in the world. And so he emphasizes that in the letter from Birmingham jail. Throughout this period, as I've emphasized, Goldwater is staying quiet mostly, and encouraging others to do the same. Goldwater is using language. So one of the things I highlight is the speech Goldwater gave sort of early in that timeline I just described in 1961. So it's just after the 60 election. Kennedy beats Nixon. It's just before Kennedy delivers his inaugural address. And Goldwater is already being rumored as a possible presidential candidate in 1964. So Goldwater goes to the floor of the Senate in January 1961, about a week before Kennedy's going to deliver his inaugural address. And Goldwater delivers what I think he imagines would be what his inaugural address might sound like if it was him standing up there. And his speech has a really innocuous title, like Republican Statement of Principles and Objectives. But it's really a forgotten American speech. And the language that he uses is very much present in our own politics today. Goldwater describes the forgotten or silent American, he uses the language silent American as well, as the man who pays his taxes, prays, behaves himself, and stays out of trouble. They are forgotten and effectively silenced, Goldwater explained, because they are lost in the clamor created by competing pressure groups that have come to dominate American politics. And then he lists some of these pressure groups: labor unions, farm organizations, racial groups, and so on, who fight for their constituencies while the individual, Goldwater says, silent, forgotten American, stands alone. So one of the things I ask in the book is, when Goldwater is imagining this forgotten American, what does he look like? It seems clear to me that this individual has a racial identity in Goldwater's mind, right? What is this person's race? Where does he work? What are the power relationships like that dominate his workplace? Goldwater he said explicitly during the 64 campaign, and I quote, "I think the less we say about civil rights, the better off we are going to be." And Goldwater got away with this most of the time. One of the things that, so if you look at coverage of Goldwater in the mainstream press, Time Magazine, Life Magazine, these sorts of things, almost every article is the same. This is before his run for president. It's Goldwater in his flight suit. He was a pilot. He'd fly around to campaign events on his own plane, that sort of thing. Goldwater in his cowboy outfit. Goldwater is really good at sort of this image making. Goldwater with his ham radio. When it got to Goldwater's politics, it would talk about how Goldwater shoots from the hip. He's going to tell you what he thinks, even if it's not politically popular to do so. And one of the suspicions I had going into the research for the book is that no one had really written about how the African-American press was covering Goldwater. And I thought it might be a different story. And indeed it was. And so one of the exchanges that I thought I'd share with you is in 1963, sort of right after the Birmingham campaign, Goldwater is in his Senate office. He's already, he's being now really talked up as a presidential candidate. And he's holding forth with reporters. So, and the reporter for the Chicago Daily Defender, a great African-American newspaper, describes the scene, not just what he's being said, but the scene in a really powerful way. He says that Goldwater had his feet up on the desk, and he's leaning back and sort of holding forth, answering questions from these reporters. And one of the things that that Goldwater says in this conversation is, he says to the, and to be fair to Goldwater, I'll just quote him. He says that, I like the musical accompaniment will give me a chance to find the quote. There we go. So he says to these reporters, they ask him about race relations in the South. And he says, I campaigned all over the South for Nixon in 1960. And I told the audiences I believed in states' rights. I told them that I didn't think it was my business as an Arizonan to come and tell them what to do. That's the real issue in the South. It's not integration, but states' rights. So Goldwater would say this sort of thing all the time, and usually no one called him on it. But then one of the reporters speaks up and says, "Do you really believe that, Senator?" And then the Chicago Daily Defender reporter describes, added drama to the scene by giving us a sense of the physical movement that accompanied the rhetoric. The question startled Goldwater. His foot came down off the table as he leaned forward across the desk. "Why, yes, I do. You guys ought to visit the South and see what's going on down there." Now, Goldwater thought maybe he'd won, but he was wrong. Another reporter speaks up. "I'm from South Carolina," the journalist said, "and I visit quite often. And I had the impression that integration certainly is an issue. In fact, the issue in the South." The Defender reporter then added more color to the scene by observing that this comment caused Goldwater to ponder for a moment, or for a while, before he agreed that, quote, there were some people in the South for whom the whole question of racial mixing is a red flag. So this is one of those moments, and there are a few moments like this in the book where Goldwater seems genuinely startled when he's questioned about these things, and I can tell you more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. Just to give you a sense, leading up to the Republican convention, where Goldwater and King will come the closest in my story to crossing paths. They never had any meaningful interaction with each other, but they did almost cross paths. They were both at the Republican convention in 1964 for different reasons. But I want to give you a sense of, again, coming back to this idea of how King was being perceived by white Americans, and certainly by the American right in this era. This is a billboard that was all over the South. It was also published as a postcard. I've been in one archive at Stanford, the Hoover Institution, and there's one collection where, there must be 1,000 of these postcards in this collection. I'm like, I guess they had a lot of them as they're collecting this material. But so this was the kind of thing that was being spread all over the place. And you can see the language there. Martin Luther King at Communist Training School is the way this postcard was introduced, and this billboard was put up around the South. And this was sponsored by the White Citizens Council, which Bayard Rustin, one of King's closest advisors and allies, called the Uptown Klan. So same values, different outfits is what I like to say. This was really another terrorist group that terrorized people in a different way. They didn't burn crosses and dress in hoods, but they would destroy people's lives economically and socially if they thought they were too friendly to civil rights. And so this is the kind of thing, this is a kind of an extreme example of the kind of thing that King was getting from the American right. And one of the big questions at the Republican convention in 1964, there were two big issues. And we'll get to those in one second. The two big issues are civil rights and extremism. How is the Goldwater campaign going to handle extremist groups like the White Citizens Council, the John Birch Society, this anti-communist conspiracy theory-oriented group? Those are the two big issues, so they'll come back to those in a second. So to fast forward to July 1964, just before Goldwater will be nominated for president, by now he's secured the Republican nomination more or less. He still has to get nominated officially in San Francisco. But King, in July, and this picture is from June 1964, King is in St. Augustine, Florida, engaged in another direct action campaign to challenge segregation in the city. And he is there, right here you can see him standing in the doorway of the Munson Motor Lodge, which was an establishment where he was not allowed to enter the restaurant or to stay in the hotel. And James Brock, the proprietor of the hotel, is standing in the doorway. King gets arrested in St. Augustine, and he's in jail there. But a few days later, after King's arrested, there's another direct action in St. Augustine, Florida. And this one was a coordinated attempt. A group of rabbis come to this same doorway, and Brock is standing there, and they kneel and pray in front of the doorway. And Brock is telling them they have to leave, and so they're going to get arrested by law enforcement because they refuse to leave. But the rabbis were actually meant to be a distraction, because at the same time they're doing that, two white guests of the hotel, who were actually undercover civil rights activists, let some African-American activists in to the pool area, and they jump in the pool together. So instead of a sit-in, it's a wade-in. Brock catches wind of this, the proprietor, and he goes out to the pool and he starts shouting and ranting and raving, and goes and gets muriatic acid and tries to pour it on the activists in the pool to try to do them harm if he can. And so the same day that's happening, when that news is hitting the 6 o'clock news, Goldwater is walking to the floor of the Senate to announce his opposition to what will become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the two titles in the act that Goldwater says the reasons he's voting against it are because of Title II, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in public accommodations, like hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues open to the public. And Title VII, which prohibits employment discrimination. So Goldwater, in his speech, explains that he thinks those two titles are unconstitutional, and that's the primary reason for his vote against the bill. But he goes beyond that, and I think it's important to know that it's not just a matter of Goldwater standing on constitutional principle and doing the unpopular thing. That's how he frames it, but I think there's more to the story than that. Goldwater says in this short speech that he delivers on the floor of the Senate that this is fundamentally a matter of the heart. The problems of discrimination, he says, can never be cured by laws alone. And so he says that this civil rights bill has been promoted by political demagoguery, emotion, political pressure, not persuasion, not common sense, not deliberation. And so he says he's going to oppose the bill. So for more than just constitutional reasons, really for some moral reasons and some reasons that he thinks have to do with how we do politics. So that brings into relief, right? Seeing King and hearing what was happening at the Munson Motor Lodge on the ground, I mean, it brings this question before us, right? To think about. Goldwater is saying it is a threat to freedom to empower the federal government to do things like tell James Brock that he must allow African Americans to come into his business like anybody else. Goldwater sees that as a threat to freedom, and King has a different point of view. He thinks that freedom requires that people can move freely in social and economic spheres, and so these two are about to clash. So, I mean, this is getting a little bit ahead, but during the campaign, there's this sort of campaign material that is meant to try to capitalize on any backlash against the recently passed civil rights bill. Okay, I want to take you to the convention, and I'm about to wrap up. and then we can have time for conversation. I'll wrap up quickly. How am I doing? Should I wrap up? We're good? Okay. I get into this stuff. I'm verbalicious. This book is 100. So I was supposed to be 100,000 words. And I was in like 1963 and I already had like 150,000 words. And so the first draft was 175,000 words. And as my friend said, Nick, that's 75% more than what they wanted. So anyway, but I want to highlight this, a couple moments from the 1964 convention. And I really wanted to show this image. This is a man named George Parker, who is the only African-American delegate on the Republican Platform Committee. There's about 40 African-American delegates out of over 1,300 delegates to the convention that would nominate Goldwater. And that was historically not true. There were plenty of African-American delegates, of course, throughout history. And Parker, it's this remarkable moment. Everybody know the Norman Rockwell, painting, like the freedom of speech when the guy's standing up at the town meeting. Like this George Parker, this photograph is the Norman Rockwell moment in the book. Goldwater comes before, so King spoke before the Platform Committee. This is something he had done in 1956 and 1960. He would speak to both the Republican and Democratic Platform Committees in order to try to encourage them to, protect civil rights and other concerns of his in their platforms. So King was in San Francisco at the convention that would nominate Goldwater. Goldwater wasn't quite there yet, and so they probably didn't, cross paths. But they were standing in the same space, which I think is kind of remarkable. And so Goldwater gets there. So King delivers his address to the Platform Committee. He says, "I want this party to commit itself in a deep and meaningful way to the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act that was just passed, that your nominee just voted against." And so that's one thing that King wants. He also wants the Republican Party and the Democratic Party to commit to what he called an economic Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, a massive commitment to dealing with economic inequality in the country. So then Goldwater comes before the Platform Committee, and he makes a few cursory remarks, and then he fields questions from members of the Platform Committee. And about 3 questions in, this gentleman, George Parker, stands up and is acknowledged. And George Parker, just to give you a sense, he's about 80 years old. So for George Parker, in a really meaningful way, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. And he is at a convention where all of a sudden, he's seeing the Confederate flag waving around the convention hall. He's seeing the promise, and Goldwater is saying things that are indicating this is very much his intention. Goldwater is saying things like, we have to go hunting where the ducks are. We're not going to get the African-American vote anymore. We need to try to bring the Southern segregationists into the Republican Party. And Parker is there to stand up and to speak out against this. And so he says to Goldwater, I want you, so Goldwater, I should say, by then is saying, the platform is going to include a plank that says we will enforce the Civil Rights Act. It's the law of the land, we will enforce it. Goldwater has said, as president, I will enforce the Civil Rights Act. But Parker isn't satisfied. He says to Goldwater, I want you to convince me that you will use the moral authority of the presidency to try to teach this country that this is not only the law of the land, but it's the right thing to do. And they go back and forth, and Goldwater, and let's just say Parker does not leave satisfied with Goldwater's response. So Goldwater delivers the speech I played a clip from earlier, in which he talks about extremism and defense of liberty, and then King will work hard to build the coalition that will defeat Goldwater in dramatic fashion. Here's Goldwater on election night. You saw at the bottom of the screen there, he loses by quite a bit, right? 61% to 39% in the popular vote. He wins 5 states, just barely wins his home state of Arizona. He wins in landslides in the Deep South, in 4 states in the Deep South. And I want to conclude with this, just so give you a sense of where the story, the sort of narrative of the book ends. And I'm just going to read you a little passage from the end. So after Goldwater loses, he's out of politics for a little while, and he comes back and runs for Senate in 1968 and gets reelected. King, Goldwater is defeated. King wins the Nobel Peace Prize in late 1964. There's all sorts of reasons why you'd think King would be feeling a sense of triumph, but he's not. He's deeply depressed. And one of the reasons he's deeply depressed is that J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, has declared war on him and is really trying to destroy him. Is literally doing things like sending him a package to try to get him to commit suicide. And so in December 1964, King is in his native Atlanta, and he's there to support a strike of women who are on strike at a factory called Scripto. And I just want to give you, I just want to read you a passage about this that I think kind of brings everything together, or at least it did for me. So Georgia had adopted Goldwater's beloved right to work policy, which made it possible for workers to opt out of union membership. And Scripto, this company, had resisted a checkoff system that would allow the union to collect dues from worker paychecks. This was something Goldwater believed to be essential to the workers' political and economic freedom. From his point of view, the Scripto workers had little to complain about. King disagreed. In 1964, historian Michael K. Honey explains, the 700 women who worked at Scripto made $1.25 an hour, a total of about $2,600 before deductions, when the commonly estimated national poverty level for a family wage earner was $3,000. The right to work law, which allowed many of the company's skilled workers to refuse to join the union, and the lack of a checkoff system left these 700 women in an especially vulnerable position. But they had had enough. On Thanksgiving Day, they voted to strike. When King was photographed on the picket line that December, he wore a sign around his neck that read, "Scripto employees are on strike for a living wage." What did King see in the faces of the women who marched on that picket line? And had he been there, what might Goldwater have seen? For King, the plight of the Scripto workers brought into relief the ways in which so many Americans remained unfree. The company was offering the women a 2-cent hourly raise, leaving them earning $1.27 an hour. Even if the union succeeded in getting the women twice that, how much would their lives really change? Could Goldwater say with a straight face that the average woman on that assembly line was as free as their boss? And if not, what might be done to close the gap? While Goldwater does not seem to have been especially troubled by such questions, King agonized over them. He worried that these women might never be able to earn a wage that honored the dignity of their labor. He worried that they might soon see their sons sent off to die in Vietnam. Tangled up in both those worries was the haunting sense that despite all the legislative and judicial victories, Americans had still not come to terms with just how deeply racial injustice was embedded in our economic, political, and social institutions. King grappled with how to lead the next phase in the struggle for liberation while recognizing that this leadership made him a bigger and bigger target for attack. One night that December, King left home without telling anyone where he was going. His family worried. He was not well. The weight of the world was crushing him. His mother was so concerned she called a family friend who was a police officer to ask if he might go look for her son. While the officer searched for King, the 35-year-old minister stood waiting out in the cold outside the Scripto plant. He was hoping to catch some of the workers during the shift change in the dark of night. One wonders what he was thinking as he stood there, waiting. Perhaps it might have occurred to him that it was almost exactly 9 years earlier that he rose to speak at Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery in support of the rebellious women who started the bus boycott. Now he found himself again, working in support of a group of rebellious women, hell-bent on achieving economic dignity. Perhaps he pondered how far the movement had come in just 9 short years. But even if he did, he would have been haunted by how much further the movement needed to go on the road toward freedom. As he waited for the shift change, one can imagine him praying, and one can also imagine him weeping. But then the creak of the door broke the silence, and the workers approached. One can imagine King straightening up and getting ready. There was work yet to be done. Thank you so much. So we're going to take questions, and there are roving microphones. So if you just raise your hand and wait for the microphone, that way we can get picked up on the live stream and all that jazz.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I found it fascinating. It's 60 years later. What parallels can you draw from that time to now?
It's good to start with an easy one, right? Yeah, thank you. Lots, I think that there's so many aspects of this story that feel so relevant. And I had so I didn't say at the beginning, I should have said I've had such a wonderful time interacting with the community here at Grand Valley State. And I had this really powerful moment yesterday with a student who came up and asked a similar question and kind of framed it in a slightly different way, which was, which is that how can the student sort of frame it as like, how can I avoid being overwhelmed by the sense that we're having the same conversations still? And I don't know, I don't know that I have any special insight into that. But yeah, I think that, a couple things I'll say about that I didn't really say perhaps enough about in the presentation. Right as I was, I think I'd probably already handed in the book. Oh yeah, I had handed in the book. But sort of the election happened, and then there was, of course, the sort of episode that we may remember of the Doge, and what was going on there. And one thing that really struck me as I did this research was that, King, I knew that King was a critic of Goldwater, but what I guess I didn't know was just how much King emphasized not just the civil rights question, but the economic question in his critique of Goldwater. So, when King gives, I think probably his most, kind of one of his most significant speeches opposing Goldwater, really, probably have more content about Goldwater, that's sort of what he sees as the dangers of Goldwater's economic point of view compared to anything else. And so Goldwater gives a speech, and that King kind of would use this speech as kind of his central piece of evidence. It's a speech that he gave at the Waldorf Astoria, of all places, fancy hotel, a bunch of wealthy donors. I think we've heard this story before as well. And he says, to these wealthy donors, he says, the problem in America is when it comes to poverty. I mean, he says a lot of things in the speech, but one of the things he says that really got King was he says that we have people who lack intelligence and ambition because they don't have enough get up, that they need to sort of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and that sort of a thing. And when King, heard this sort of language, it struck, he thought that this guy doesn't really get it. King, when he's talking about the Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, which is such a radical departure from the sorts of things Goldwater is talking about the threat of big government, the way it undermines freedom. And King is trying to, make an argument for a series of federal programs, because that's what he thinks is necessary to address the size of these issues that apply across the board to disadvantaged people regardless of race. But he says they are going to have a disproportionate impact on African American people because of the history in this country, right? It's not a mistake that the economic distribution is what it is. This is rooted in history, and as James Baldwin would say, history is present in all that we do. And so Goldwater, when King reflects on Goldwater saying things like that, King, ever the preacher, relies on scripture, and he says, he goes to that line, "Lord, forgive them; they know not what they do," and that's King being very forgiving, and saying that he thinks that if Goldwater really understood the weight of that history, then he would think otherwise. That might have been too hopeful, but that was his hope. And King, but King recognized that in the meantime, I'm going to fight him, and I'm going to try to make sure he's defeated. So I think a lot of those questions, whether it comes to questions of economic justice or questions of racial justice, the sort of the debate that's going on in this story is very much with us today. And we could turn on cable news and see a lot of these same arguments being made in all sorts of different ways, which is sad, but it's also, I think, the truth.
Thank you. Two questions. One is just a question about whether anti-Semitism played any kind of role. Like what did being Jewish, how did that influence Goldwater? But this question of the sort of parallel, I'm wondering if you can say more about that concept of freedom as having, having a collective dimension. I'm thinking about that because I heard Marshall Gans talk about what's the difference between now and, say, the civil rights movement. And he said one of the things that we don't have today necessarily are the kind of social networks that we are a little bit too isolated from each other. So I guess what I would love to know a little bit about is that vision of freedom that requires connectivity and collectivity. So if you could say a little bit more about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. So on the question, the first question about anti-Semitism, there's some really interesting moments in this story. Goldwater's father was Jewish. He laments that his father was not practicing, and Goldwater laments later in life that he didn't really know anything about that side of his history. And there are these stories about Goldwater, some of which may be apocryphal, but they're still great, where like Goldwater talks about, there's one story where he goes to golf with a friend at a country club in Phoenix, and they go to check in, and the friend's a member of this club, and they're signing in whatever one. I don't golf, but you sign something, I guess. Fill out your little scorecard or whatever. And they look at his name and say, Goldwater. Is that a Jewish name? And Goldwater says, yes, it is. And he says, we don't allow Jewish people to play on our course. And Goldwater says, well, I'm only half Jewish. Can I play 9 holes? I don't know. I've heard different things whether or not he actually said that, but it's the kind of thing he would say. But yeah, I think that it was there. One of the kind of some of the things I quote in the book that are just sort of, that are very, these strange moments. So after Goldwater is nominated, he gets a couple of endorsements from like leaders in the Ku Klux Klan. And you see in the language that they sort of, I have a couple of quotes from these Klan leaders, and they're in an awkward position because Goldwater and then William Miller, his running mate, is a Catholic. So these Klansmen are like, gosh, we're really stuck here, but we don't like Johnson, But it's kind of, I don't know if funny is the right word, but the way the Goldwater campaign handles that, initially his campaign manager says, "Come on in." This is very much relevant to some of the conversations we're having today. If you support us in good faith, then come on into we got a big tent. Then Goldwater, I think somebody, probably Nixon, I think, says this is not the right answer. You don't say you want these people to come in. So they revise their position a week later and say, actually, we don't really want you guys to support us. But yeah, I think it's one of the parts of this, because of what's happening in some of these extreme groups on the right. It's a weird moment. Goldwater is a strange vehicle, for some of these things, for a lot of those reasons. And I do think that some of Goldwater's, kind of personal, his personal feelings, his personal sense of the wrongness of racism and discrimination on some level, like this is something I think he was sincere in a lot of moments in his life when he expressed that, including in his speech announcing he's opposing the Civil Rights Act, where he talks about this. I think that his experience as somebody with the last name Goldwater in Arizona, had something to do with that. And I think it's, but it does sort of still leave, there's still this gap there. And I don't, that's one of the things I'm asking readers to sort of, to think about that gap. And then on the second question, this is a big question. Maybe connecting back to the first question of how do we apply the lessons of this story to today? And certainly, the story of King and the role of the Black church and the role of these different organizations. And as you said, the sort of networks of activity, how do we translate that into the present? I don't know. I'm not, but I think it's an important thing. I think that there's something about, and one conversation that I've been having a lot as I've been going around talking about the book is kind of what can we take away from this story about, sort of leadership that King models, and is there something there that's useful, but also being awake to the senses in which there might be things about this story that don't apply. Brennan Terry has this new book about the sort of the tragedy of the civil rights movement, where I think Terry's arguing that there's something about, this story, as important as it is historically. I think part of Terry's argument is that it sometimes isn't the right story for us to to use now in terms of making sense of where we are. And so I very much am awake to that and alive to that, and I feel like it's definitely worth thinking about. So yeah, I don't have a great answer for the second question, but I think it's a good question for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't really even know how to ask this. So, is it possible now to have a leader or a prophet like King who stands up for and represents the disadvantaged the way he did for society in the 60s?
Oh, wow. Yes and no. I mean, I guess I think that because of our media environment is as it is, and we have this, I mean, I guess anything is possible, right? I mean, I guess there's something about King's style that it seems so out of step with so much of what we're seeing. And that, we were talking at lunch today, or one of these meetings I had today with some brilliant group of people about, this sort of way in which I think it was at lunch of like when King's talking about the reasons why, he's committed on this deep philosophical level to nonviolence is this idea that we have to be committed to this thing of not wanting to humiliate our opponent. That it's not about defeating somebody. It's about something else. It's about actually trying to win them over with love, right? To try to sort of treat everyone as a potential saint. Is one of the ways King describes it. And I think about our current political culture, and now we're seeing all these like kind of debate, these little like I'm going to debate 30 people or whatever things, and also the sort of politics of like TikTok videos of like this one owning that one, and in terms of winning an argument or making somebody look silly. That seems very much, out of, the King's very much out of step with that. So I don't, and I don't know what it's going to take for our political culture to snap out of where we are right now, in terms of how we engage with one another. So yeah, I mean, it feels like right now is not a moment when somebody like King could get traction in a sense where we imagine somebody who really does have like sort of broad support. But I do think that it's possible within certain communities where there is a sense of commitment to a common cause or a sense of justice, where I do think that something like that might be possible, or different, maybe not one singular person. And King was always careful to say like, look, this isn't about me, right? And I think that's an important point too. But yeah, great question.
Thanks very much, Nick, for that talk. I have a question about the extent to which you in the book cover some of Goldwater's other libertarian views, because it's pretty clear that he helped kind of shape the Southern strategy in the Republican Party with respect to race. But in other ways, he was a libertarian on things like right to choose, right, for women, and in some other issues of morality. That kind of Western conservatism, which really didn't win the day, obviously, in the Republican Party. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about sort of where he won and where he lost in that sense.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Absolutely. I mean, this is because I was so far over word count, and I wasn't quite sure. I had a vision of this book kind of ending in 1968, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. And then as I got to the sort of stuff in late 64, I felt like this is where it should end. So I don't really, and even in the epilogue, I talk a little bit about later Goldwater, but this is an important point, right? That Goldwater, Goldwater did a lot. I mean, Goldwater was, for me as a writer, was a far more likable character than, for example, William F. Buckley was in the end with my last book. And that's a whole nother story. You got to read it to find out. But Goldwater was somebody who, he did have his, this strong independent streak that I think was both extraordinarily, it could be like it was like, like a lot of things, like our virtues are frequently our vices in disguise. Like it was both his greatest virtue and maybe his greatest vice. And I'll tell you what I mean. It's like the examples you gave, like Goldwater eventually will play some role in, pushing Nixon to resign is one of, I think, Goldwater's better moments. And then later on, and again, depending on where one stands on these issues, we can have a debate about, Goldwater's views on various social questions, but Goldwater ends up, being, progressive on gay rights. He has a gay grandson, and I think that contributes to some of his attitudes. And he's very deeply at odds with the religious right, on all sorts of questions, including, some of the issues you named. And so, one of my favorite moments, another great Goldwater line is, he's, Jerry Falwell, leader of the religious right. It says when Reagan nominates Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, O'Connor was an Arizonan. O'Connor had worked on Goldwater's campaign. They were friends. And Jerry Falwell says, every good Christian needs to line up to oppose the nomination of Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court. And Goldwater says, every good Christian needs to line up and kick Jerry Falwell in the ass. I'm quoting Goldwater there. So I think that there's a kind of way in which Goldwater would, he would just sort of like call him as he saw him. And so that's the good. I think there's some of that I find to be, very, there's elements of that, of course, that are I think extraordinarily important and, from my point of view, often admirable. I would say that the kind of underside of that is that Goldwater would sometimes I think he took the idea of being a maverick was so central to his identity that it did funny things with his mind. And I'll give you one example that was really weird in the book that I discovered is that Goldwater, when he's reflecting later on voting against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in multiple editions of his memoir, so somebody should have caught this, he remembers being the only senator who voted against it. And so it's like a weird thing because you wonder how's he remembering what the segregationists did? There were only 27 who voted against the bill, but I think that for him, and I think he's mixing it up in his mind with the Kennedy-Irvin labor bill, which he was there was one other, it was the Test Ban Treaty. There's one other famous bill that he was the lone vote against it. But so I think that there's something about, so I just, and again, those two things are probably, they're maybe related to each other, but not the same. But then there's something about that kind of maverick independent streak that often led to some really surprising, outcomes. And then, sometimes it, I think, got the best of him. Yeah.
Thank you. I was intrigued with that term you use about conscientious collaboration. That to me, because it's so hard to keep people, I can't even keep my family moving in the same direction, let alone to spark a movement.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how they held it together long enough there, because there was so much tension. This thing could have fallen apart at so many turns much earlier. How they were able to really marshal that energy. And then are you seeing anything that we could pull from that now, or glimmers of people now who are keeping that conscientious collaboration alive? It's so hard in this political environment now, and is it a quaint thing, like a thing of the past?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that the stories that I'm telling in this book, I think one of the things that King is able to express so beautifully and powerfully is, again, like he recognizes, and he says early on in that Time magazine, where he's on the cover of Time magazine, he really tries to emphasize, there's some people who are kind of not thrilled that he's being featured as like the face of this movement when there's all these, it's about all these people doing the work on the ground. And King tries to emphasize when they interview him that this is about, had I never come along, this would still be happening. And it's about the people who are taking action themselves and coordinating with each other. And I think that, so I'll say, like, philosophically, I think what King is reflecting on that, he thinks it's really important, even though it's not always fashionable to do so, to kind of confess our vulnerability, right? And to recognize the ways in which we need one another in order to be free. And so he says we're in this inescapable network of mutuality, and we cannot be otherwise. And so anybody who's telling you that you can go it alone is not telling you the truth. And so I think that's the kind of philosophical answer. And then I think that, one of the things that comes through for me in thinking about this as, how this history might apply today is, and I feel like this has come up in different ways in the classes I've visited and conversations I've had over these last couple of days, is that, one of the things that comes through in the story is that there are so many different roles to play, like in trying to promote justice. And I think King, as he gets drawn further and further into a kind of political role, he really, he's grappling with some really difficult questions of leadership, and we're thinking about leadership in this center, right? Where he's got to think about, both what is right to him as a matter of principle and how he can, coordinate and conscientiously collaborate with those around him, and then what the sort of demands of politics require. So, one example of that is, at the 1964 Democratic Convention, there's a group of African Americans from Mississippi who are making a case, a very strong case, to say, why are you going to sit the Mississippi regulars, the normal Democratic delegation from Mississippi, they're all going to vote for Goldwater. So what you should do, so the Fannie Lou Hamer and a number of other activists, started this thing called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and say, we're going to support Johnson. You should seat us. And King is in this really difficult position where now he's dealing with President Johnson, and he's trying to figure out, he's in terms of, he admires and believes in the conscientious collaboration of that Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He thinks they're absolutely right as a matter of principle. He, like everybody else, sees Fannie Lou Hamer testify, before the Credentials Committee and talk about being beaten because she was trying to register to vote and losing her job and so on. But he also is trying to figure out, I don't want to do anything to undermine Johnson's chance of success. And so I say all that to say that I think that, and so, again, who is right, who is wrong in that context, we can debate that. But I do feel like there's a lot of that in today's politics, these questions of how do we balance our commitments, our fundamental commitments to matters of moral principle with the demands of the political world we see around us. And again, I have no profound, insight on these questions. And so I kind of think of my work, though, as trying to help us, trying to reconstruct, try to tell these stories so that we can, again, hold them up as a kind of mirror and think about, how they might guide us in our own political lives. So thank you all so much. And I'll be out here, talking with anybody who wants to talk to me and signing books and all that stuff. So I'll hand it over. Thank you so much. I'll move out. Thank you.
Dr. Buccola. Take your time. Yeah. What a wonderful program to end our semester on. I want to thank you again for coming. Dr. Buccola will be out in the lobby. We do have his books for sale if any of you are interested in grabbing a copy. And of course, he can sign those for you. I do just want to note too, we have our dessert reception awaiting you. And as I was walking up, I had a couple here say to me, "We lived this." And so I want to remind, especially the students who are in the audience tonight, go find someone who lived this and ask them a question about it as you're eating your cookies and drinking your coffee, because it is one thing to hear from a scholar who has studied this. It is in many ways equally valid to talk to someone who lived through it. So that is part of what we try to do here, is to have conversation where we can learn and we can be with one another. So again, we want to encourage you to do that. Thank you all again for a great fall. We will see you back on January 29 for our first program of the winter semester. We'll be welcoming author and historian Molly Beer, who has written a fantastic biography of Angelica Schuyler. So all you Hamilton fans, get ready, go brush up, and we'll look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you.